let the games begin. Accusations of pay-to-play, flip-flopping, and the release of a video reminiscent of Mitt Romney's 47%. All this and the primary election for Illinois governor is still only 2 months away. So who's up, who's down, who's on the attack, who's playing defense? Here to break down the latest in an increasingly bitter race, Dave McKinney. He is the Springfield bureau chief of the Chicago Sun-Times. Amanda Vinicky, she is the State House bureau chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS. And Mark Anderson, writer and blogger for NBC Chicago's Wardroom. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight. So Dave, last week you broke that minimum wage story. And since then, it's been a kind of cascade of stories on Bruce Rauner. Kind of collapse it for us, will you, and summarize what this story has been?
Well, I mean, it started last week, Carol, when some Democrats were making an issue out of comments that Rauner made during a candidates forum in the Quad Cities. And there he said that he favored rolling back the minimum wage so that the state minimum wage of $8.25 per hour was consistent with the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. And the Democrats were saying that was delusional, that it was class warfare on the poor. And so, you know, I picked that up and did a little story off that, as did others. And, you know, the next day, Rauner issued a mea culpa, essentially, you know, saying, you know, I'm not for that anymore. I'm for raising the minimum wage.
In fact, he didn't say for it anymore. I said he was misunderstood or misspoke.
Correct. He was flippant and, yeah, misunderstood, flippant. And that his, you know, all the nuances of his position weren't really spelled out in that little snapshot that we had on video. And so, you know, he comes out with that, and then another video emerges, and this one is from September during a candidates forum downstate in a town called Gibson City in Ford County. And there he's saying he was adamantly opposed to increasing the minimum wage at all. So, you know, in the span of about 36 hours there, we have a candidate who is saying that he's for, you know, rolling back the minimum wage, to increasing the minimum wage, then to being against increasing it at all. So business groups, people around were confused even, you know, what was his position on this? And of course his rivals in the Republican primary were feasting on that.
And then comes today the story of contribution to Walter Payton High School, where his daughter got in after he made a call to Arne Duncan. The cumulative value of all of these stories, or damage, Amanda, do we even really know yet?
Well, you have a candidate here who is still trying to become known not only to voters but also to insiders as well. So as Dave talked about, the business community, for example, wanting to know where Bruce Rauner stands on issues that were he to be elected Illinois' governor, they have a vested interest in, things such as the minimum wage. They don't know where he stands on that. So I think it hurts him twofold. First of all, you have a guy who's trying to say, I'm a serious contender despite having no experience in politics in the past, and yet he's being undercut by his positions. And then again, these individuals who are, you know, he clearly has enough money, so that's not an issue for him. But nonetheless, in terms of sheer support, where I think he's going to struggle because people now just see him as a flip-flopper, kind of almost a Scrooge. You talk about the Walter Payton, for example, contribution after his daughter had gotten, it seems, rejected from this prep academy, but then ultimately in after a phone call or two, as you have Bruce Rauner trying to say that he doesn't have any special interests. Well, clearly he would very well owe somebody, or it looks as if perhaps he tried to help that out with a reward there. So you've got a guy who's a multi-million-dollar who wants to, you know, he's put multi-millions into his own campaign, and it looks like he's a Scrooge that's wanting to roll back the minimum wage and letting his daughter leave, you know, New Trier High School for this prep academy.
Mark, is this a 47% Mitt Romney moment, or is this exploding into something that really will shrink back pretty quickly?
I don't know if it's a 47% Mitt Romney moment yet, but I think the challenge is that for candidates that are very wealthy, who are trying to present themselves to an electorate as either regular guys or downplay that wealthy aspect of their life, it's difficult to be seen advocating for something like cutting the minimum wage or advocating for a policy that is against working families. So I would imagine as we go down this campaign, not only are Republican primary opponents going to continue to season this, but should he make it through the general election, Democrats are going to have attack ad after attack ad lined up specifically talking about this. Can he survive it? Possibly. He's got a lot of money. But still, this is something that's probably not going to go away.
So you've got three other Republicans here, Bill Brady and Kirk Dillard, who've already done this campaign 4 years ago, and Dan Rutherford, who's the state treasurer. Have they, because they don't have the money that Bruce Rauner has by a long shot, have they capitalized? Have they made hay? Have they managed to drive a hole through some of this, Dave?
Well, I mean, we saw Bill Brady borrowing a page from Pat Quinn and doing a Sunday afternoon press conference, and you know, they're trying to take advantage of free media. Clearly, they don't have the money to put ads on TV, and so that's how they've been taking advantage of this the last couple of days. You know, Brady was out in front of the Thompson Center yesterday. You know, making the case that if we can't understand what Rauner's position is on the minimum wage, if he's not being truthful about that, then how is he being truthful about what his relationship with Stu Levine was? Stu Levine, of course, was the con man and Blagojevich fundraiser who was voted in favor of an investment that benefited one of Rauner's investment companies. You know, these guys, they have no money, so they're trying to scrum and do anything they can inexpensively to get their word out.
But they also have their own problems in terms of consistencies, do they not? I mean, whether it's Kirk Dillard or Bill Brady or Dan Rutherford, have they always had a coherent, consistent message of their own?
No, so you look at, for example, the minimum wage issue. First of all, none of them capitalized that back in December when Rauner made these remarks in the first place. It had to
Did
be
they know about
Democrats.
those
I mean,
remarks?
they were there. Yeah, it was a candidate forum. So that's really remarkable that none of the campaigns, that their press aides, what have you, that were all there and heard those comments, didn't call Dave, didn't call me, didn't call you, any of us, to say, hey, can you believe what this guy's saying? It had to wait for Democrats to come out with this message, because that's where we may see some of these other candidates get a little bit of a lift, because Rauner is going to start to be the subject of some opposition from his own camp as well. So we do have that. But as you mentioned, in terms of the other candidates, even as they're struggling to try and get free media, for example, Kirk Dillard has had varying positions on the minimum wage. He once upon a time voted for it. He then said that he wanted to be subject to market forces. So he's struggling to also come away with a clear-cut message. This Payton issue, Rauner is trying to throw it back. I think it is very different, but he's trying to throw it back at the candidates, because each of those candidates had students that were on the quote-unquote clout list of helping individuals get into the University of Illinois.
So he's saying,
different
look
situation,
at you guys.
but exactly. Mhm.
So as we watch this thing progress, you have the Republican Party itself, which seems to be at war a bit. Rauner will not be going to a Tea Party debate tomorrow night. Right. There is a PAC that's working against him. Right. So do we have the classic divisions inside the conservative wing and the moderate wing, the Illinois Republican Party, that they are not coalescing behind a candidate?
I think to some extent we do, or at least we're seeing the very beginning of it. The problem is that the Republicans in the state of Illinois are really, really desperate to take the governorship back. It's been a long time for them. And I think if we had a front runner, and we'll just for the sake of the moment assume Rauner is a front runner, if we had a front runner who wasn't like Bruce Rauner, I think we'd see a lot of Republicans across the state who'd be willing to accept whoever came out of the primary process and get behind. Rauner's going to be a very divisive figure, though. It's going to be difficult for a lot of folks to get behind. What's interesting, I think, is that none of the other three candidates really are opposed to the idea of reducing the minimum wage, yet they're all going out and going after Bruce Rauner because they see an opportunity. So it's a kind of an internal incoherence in the Republican Party. They don't have any problem reducing the minimum wage, but they see an opportunity to attack a fellow Republican.
And let's talk about the Democrats, because there's Pat Quinn. Tio Hardiman is a candidate against him. He may be thrown off the ballot. We don't know, but a pretty nominal candidate so far anyway. Do we see Rahm Emanuel, Bill Daley, the big Obama Democrats beginning to really create a force field in behalf of Quinn going into a general election, or not?
Well, I don't think so much. I mean, about the only thing you can point to is that the Senate president's saying we're not going to pursue interest in our lawsuit, with the governor. I mean, over the legislative pay. There have been scant, moments where these guys, Cullerton and Madigan, and those guys have been behind Quinn.
It's not as instrumental. I mean, 4 years ago, it was in Democrats' interest to have a Democratic governor because there was the remap, the new legislative districts being drawn. So they wanted Quinn to be there so that they could have a Democrat to sign it. That's no longer needed. They had a pretty powerful year in 2013 that I think Governor Pat Quinn is going to take credit for. It's a whole other debate in terms of how much of that credit he deserves versus the Democratic leadership. But nonetheless, he has some monster wins for his base. So he's going to go in it with that. And at this point, all of the money that Republicans are spending fighting one another, and because Bruce Rauner, of course, with his own wealth that he's contributed to his campaign, has lifted the caps on Pat Quinn, is going to allow Pat Quinn to just continue to collect money that he'll be able to use in a general election against one of those four men.
Go ahead.
I don't think Hardiman is likely to be a challenge in any way to Quinn. But I think what's going to happen is that as Quinn, whether he believes it or not, continues to go down this path of economic populism, looking for a $10 minimum wage, looking to set up this really strong division with the Republicans, I think a lot of Democrats across the state, and certainly in Chicago, are going to be made a little bit uncomfortable about that. While they may want to support those things in name, I think they're going to have a difficult time rallying behind that idea because Pat Quinn's a little bit further out than maybe some of them might like to be on issues like the minimum wage.
And so do you think he will go out on a limb on a $10 minimum wage pre-primary? Do you think that that's going to happen?
You know, if Pat Quinn already has said that he wants it
No,
by
but
Christmas.
I mean through the legislature, because the legislature will.
No, I think that would be a little bit too soon for.
Well, you know what? I think the Senate is poised actually to take this up. I think that they could take it up just to stir up some mischief in the Republican primary. You know, I think that there's an effort underway.
Couldn't that
perhaps.
stir up some mischief for Pat Quinn in the general, too?
Well, I mean, potentially. You know, I think that the bigger issue for Quinn beyond the minimum wage is what he's going to do with this tax increase and whether or not to keep the temporary income tax in place or get rid of it. You know, and that's something he just has been refusing to answer this entire way. And so that's going to be
Yes, the next budget is
his
going to
Achilles
be.
heel.
So in terms of talkability, there is actually a U.S. Senate race here in Illinois, and that'll be actually at the very top of the ticket. Oberweis and Truax on the Republican side. Is that getting a lot of chatter?
You know, what's interesting about that race from the Republican side is that neither of the two candidates, the leading two candidates, Oberweis or Doug Truax, are really focusing on each other. They're both focusing on Dick Durbin. And what's really funny is that they both are using kind of techniques, if you will, that aren't really going to, catch a lot of attraction with voters. For example, Doug Truax recently had a big campaign event around the idea that he hand-delivered a letter to Dick Durbin's office asking him specifically if he'd ever initiated an IRS investigation against a conservative political organization. That's something that Tea Party folks care about deeply, but I don't think electorate across the state of Illinois really cares about. So I think both Oberweis and Doug Truax are kind of fighting old battles that necessarily the Illinois electorate isn't really going to have an interest in.
Well, and Durbin is, I mean, he's almost
untouchable.
bulletproof because, you know, he hasn't had any major ethics lapses. He's been consistent. And, you know, we've just seen like this series of challenges against him going back a number of years where they've just sort of been sacrificial lambs. And, you know, Oberweis is not going to carry the, I mean, he, you know, if he's the nominee, you know, he's not going to bring immense support to the ticket. Just on his name alone. I mean,
I think it's
not gonna
Republicans'
happen.
fear, in fact. It exposes all of those divisions in the Republican Party that we've talked about.
So in the State House, there seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, only a couple of races that look like they actually could be contests, and two of them are up here in the 39th and the 40th, where Tony Berrios against Will Guzzardi, right, is one of them, and in the 40th, where you've got the Deborah Mell seat that is open now suddenly, and whether it's Andrade. What's going to happen in those?
You know, I think the 39th is again a really interesting race, probably one of the most interesting in the state.
Guzzardi-Berrios, because her father is the head of the Cook County Democratic Party.
Guzzardi learned a lot of lessons from his first time when he almost knocked her
So
off.
did Tony Berrios.
So did
She
Tony
learned
Berrios.
She almost
Absolutely,
could lose.
absolutely. But Guzzardi, you know, I've talked to that campaign on a number of occasions. They just picked up the CTU endorsement the other day. They're picking up those progressive aldermen that are within the district. And again, you know, I think Guzzardi is he's an attractive candidate. He's a young, bright guy. Tony Berrios has a lot going for her, obviously, but I think Guzzardi's learned a lot from the last time, and I think that's going to be another interesting
And
race.
in the 15 seconds we have left, when it comes to the Deborah Mell seat, where Dick Mell has installed his aide, Jamie Andrade, and you've got Rob Blagojevich's lawyer running. You've
The most
got
contested
Nancy
of all the
Chavon.
primaries.
Yeah.
Actually, there are more candidates in that race than there are in any other in this state. So that's one that I think people will for sure be having to watch.
So we will keep our eyes on all of them and on your reporting as well. Thank you all for being on Chicago Tonight. David McKinney, Amanda Vinicky, and Mark Anderson. There's more on Chicago Tonight to come, so please stay with us.